So, as we just heard, the liberation of Aleppo paves the way for thousands to return to some kind of normality. They also now have access to medical and humanitarian aid. As you can see here as well, the Red Cross is working hand in hand with the Russian relief agencies. However, not everybody is looking at this in a positive way or seeing the positive aspects, far from it. In the UN General Assembly, a draft resolution demanding an immediate end to hostilities in Syria has been overwhelmingly agreed on. Of course, everyone sees a huge need for peace in this country, but Russia is pointing out that the document essentially means an end to the fight against terrorism as well, which says it's something it can't do.
The draft doesn't specify that the cessation of hostilities cannot include terrorists. The vital problem of separation between so-called moderate rebels and terrorists is not even mentioned. The resolution also doesn't take into account the current situation in and around Aleppo.
In fact, Assembly members lost their cool at times while discussing the ceasefire resolution, directly pinning the blame on those in opposition.
Only 3 members of this organisation can bring an immediate end to the suffering and collective punishment: the Assad regime and their Russian and Iranian backers. They claim that they can't because they need to defeat terrorism. Really?
Yeah. Well, the UK ambassador's debating playbook, that really appears to have been lifted from his US counterpart, Samantha Power.
Really? Really? Really?
Really? Do they need to reduce...
Sounds similar, isn't it? Next, the Assembly moved on to the issue of evacuating conflict zones in Syria.
We, as members of this General Assembly, can remember our humanity by demanding right here that Russia and the Assad regime comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, allow civilians, including the white helmets and other first responders, to leave eastern Aleppo peacefully.
Yesterday, the Syrian army suspended its offensive in eastern Aleppo to allow civilians to leave the city safely. According to the latest information we've got, 10,500 civilians have been evacuated. More than 4,000 of them are children.
Questions over humanitarian aid also riled the UN representatives.
Do they need to block humanitarian aid time after time to defeat terrorism?
Permit aid agencies finally to deliver medicine and food.
Regarding the humanitarian issue, we're providing assistance in different ways. Russia is sending a considerable amount of humanitarian aid to Syria. We're often working on this together with our foreign partners. We expect that others might follow our example.
Exchanges like the one played out during the resolution debate have come to be expected now with the Syria question.
When they put together these resolutions, they often allow the militant groups to actually basically rearm themselves, launch different offensives. What we've seen, especially on the ground, is that it is in fact the actual militant groups that have taken advantage of this, whether it's stockpiling arms, whether it's moving their forces from one area to the next. So it's not surprising that we're seeing a resolution like this be put in place at this stage.
Let's for a minute just go back to those live pictures, this drone footage there. It's a bit hazy and difficult to focus on a bit, but we want to bring it to you throughout the day because there are various shots that they're streaming through to us. This is coming through from the Russian Defense Ministry. You can see a steady flow. We've seen it for the last couple of days now, more recently, of civilians leaving those rebel-held areas. The evacuations being supported by the Russian Reconciliation Center. People leaving those danger areas using established humanitarian corridors. They're getting aid, if they can, then at the special camps that have been set up on the outskirts of the city. For its part, the Syrian army is saying it's planning to resume fighting in the rebel-held areas only after all civilians are out of that conflict zone, which is something that's happening with big haste at the moment. And those fears were compounded this week when it was made easier for the groups which assist US operations in Syria to receive military support from Washington. It's after President Obama waived part of the Arms Export Control Act. There's a newly created rebel group ready for more weapons, known as the Syrian Elite Forces. They're 45,000 strong, and according to the American army, are fighting ISIL in northern Syria. Their leader is well known to Western governments as a prominent Syrian opposition figure. In the past, he's met French President Francois Hollande and US Secretary of State John Kerry, but among US lawmakers, there are some who oppose Washington's decision.
We must stop this madness. We must stop arming terrorists. I'm introducing the Stop Arming Terrorists Act today to prohibit taxpayer dollars from being used to support terrorists.
Washington's decision to beef up its military support comes despite failing to successfully equip and train rebels in Syria previously.
هذه بعض المساعدات الأمريكية التي ألقيت للملحدين.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
We are trying to recruit and identify people that, as you put it, can be counted on to have the right mindset and ideology, not be aligned with groups like ISIL. It turns out to be very hard to identify people who meet both of those criteria.
It looks like President Obama is even loosening the standards for putting weapons into the hands of people that we don't even pretend are vetted moderates, like that fiasco with those 4 or 5 fighters that they were able to produce some months back. Now we're talking about throwing weapons out there like Christmas cookies to people that we know are terrorists.
Commenting on the decision, the U.S. State Department said that any assistance given to the rebels is carefully monitored, but they can't guarantee that the weapons won't eventually change hands. Gani Chichikan's across the story for us.
The Obama administration says that the weapons are intended for Syrian rebels fighting terrorists, notably Syrian Democratic Forces, who are now working to liberate Raqqa from ISIL. The SDF has recently teamed up with around 45,000 fighters of the so-called Syrian elite forces, so presumably they will be getting some of the weapons. Here's one of the questions that comes up with the new influx of U.S. weapons in Syria.
What will happen to these weapons after the rebels fight ISIL? Who will they be turned against?
Again, I mean, look, this is all, and this is something we've been working very hard on, and this is the last question on this, working as we liberate, or these groups, frankly, the Syrian Democratic Forces liberate territory in Syria. We work to bring and provide stability back into these cities. Work with local governments, local councils to reestablish stability in these areas. We're also working with these groups, and this is something that our special envoy Brett McGurk is in constant contact with many of these groups, as well as with Turkish authorities and others in the region on what comes next, and that's something we're looking at down the road. But the immediate priority here is defeating Daesh. And like I said, we wish that other foreign actors in Syria had those same aims.
What about, is it only against Daesh?
I've answered your questions. Please, go ahead.
It's an interesting question with al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, because the terrorists have partnered with the rebels in eastern Aleppo. According to a U.S. official, the weapons will not be going to them, but will go to rebels in other regions. However, the Obama administration says it cannot guarantee that the weapons will not end up in the hands of terrorists.
The assistance that we provide to these groups is obviously done under careful monitoring. But, of course, I'm never going to be able to say on any given battlefield, and we've talked about this before, that equipment, assistance can't change hands, but we haven't seen it recently. And, in fact, to the contrary, as ISIL has lost territory, as it's been on the run.
The administration's latest decision to send more arms to the rebels suggests that they have now found the right people, and they are in the tens of thousands.
After a short break here, we'll hear from Jamal Wakim. He's a professor of international relations, on the U.S. Secretary of Defense announcement that Washington plans to increase its numbers in Syria. It's coming up.